Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. We're here today to provide an update on the operating budget. As you know, the House and the Senate have both passed their budgets, and I want to start by saying how much I appreciate the hard work of both the House and the Senate. There are good ideas in both budgets, and I'll speak more about those good ideas a bit later. I also appreciate the many productive conversations I've been having with leadership on both sides of the aisle, and those conversations will, of course, continue. Neither budget, however, is close to one that I can sign for two key reasons. First, they each propose far too much in taxes. Second, they both rely on a wealth tax which is novel, untested, difficult to implement, and, most importantly, for purposes of adopting a sustainable budget, will face an immediate challenge in court. If the legislature wishes to complete our work on time, they need to immediately move the budget discussions in a significantly different direction on both of these issues. A month ago, I presented my proposal to save $4 billion over the next 4 years with many of you here in this room. Some folks on my side of the aisle grumbled a bit about those proposals, but both the House and the Senate adopted most of these ideas and the savings we presented. I was glad to see that they embraced the need to scrub our budget. I also appreciate that they propose their own additional savings and reductions. My team and I are reviewing those very carefully. Additionally, the budgets accept most of the $3 billion in reductions proposed by former Governor Inslee. Those reductions constitute significant progress in meeting our shortfall and demonstrate to Washingtonians that we are carefully searching the budget for efficiencies and appropriate cuts that preserve core services. Unfortunately, since our press conference several weeks ago, our budget situation has gone from bad to worse. First, we received the updated revenue forecast. I had hoped the news would be positive. Unfortunately, the forecast, as you know, adds another $1 billion to our shortfall, bringing the total to $16 billion over the next 4 years. Second, while we knew things would be rocky with the federal government, things have escalated dramatically in the last month on multiple fronts, including significant budget cuts from the federal government that result in a bigger budget challenge for us. You're seeing the headlines every day. Hospitals cutting hundreds of staff, public health funds being eliminated, food assistance reduced, all due to federal funding cuts. We can and we must prepare for even greater cuts from the federal government. We need to accept the reality that we are in the midst of unprecedented times with a federal government that is intent on making significant cuts no matter the resulting harm to Americans. This is a 5-alarm fire, and I intend to treat it that way. After a careful review of our budget situation, it is clear we cannot adopt an all-cuts budget because that would result in cutting core services. At the same time, we cannot adopt a budget with anywhere near the level of taxes currently proposed by the House and Senate. We must take a balanced approach that prepares our state for an extremely challenging situation with the federal government and our economy. I'm joined by OFM Director K.D. Chapman-C. K.D. and her team have been working extremely hard since I took office, and she's here to help answer questions, particularly for any detailed questions you may have about the budget. I do want to be very clear about my priorities with legislators and the public as we work toward a final budget. Here are 5 things I need to sign. Here are 5 things I need to see in the budget that I will ultimately sign. First, we must protect our rainy day fund, otherwise known as the Budget Stabilization Account, the BSA. My apologies if I use those terms interchangeably, but when I refer to rainy day fund, I am referring to the BSA, the Budget Stabilization Account. So we must protect our rainy day fund, every penny of it. The House budget does this, and I support that. Number 2, we must base our budget on realistic revenue projections, not the 4.5% allowed by law, which is inconsistent with the projections of the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council. The Senate budget does this, and I support that. Third, we must minimize new investments. Fourth, we must include billions of dollars in efficiencies and savings to demonstrate to the people that we have scrubbed our budget as much as possible in a way that still preserves core services such as public safety and K-12 education. And fifth, we cannot rely on a revenue source with a real possibility of being overturned by the courts. So briefly, our budget overview. Our current state budget is approximately $72 billion. That's about double what it was a decade ago. We are not in a recession. Our new budget will continue to grow. Both budgets have targeted investments I support. One example, both chambers have proposals on the response to overcrowding in juvenile rehabilitation. We have a real crisis right now and have been working in a bipartisan way to address it. That said, we need to avoid overcommitting on new investments. Given our budget realities, this is not the time for major investments in any program, no matter how worthwhile. When you've got a $16 billion budget shortfall, you've got to stop digging. Let's talk about federal funding. Funding from the federal government makes up a significant part of our state budget. 28% of our budget is federal dollars, about $43 billion per biennium. I'll just give a few examples of what that federal funding means on a biennium basis for Washington State. $34 billion for Medicaid. That's about 60% of our entire Medicaid budget. $2.5 billion for education. $1 billion for child welfare and early learning. $600 million for disaster recovery and response. $304 million for unemployment insurance. $864 million for temporary assistance for needy families. There are no guarantees that federal funding will continue in these and other areas. We saw that just last week when the federal government abruptly canceled $160 million in public health funding. That represents more than 200 state jobs, including epidemiologists and workers providing vaccines. This impacts hundreds of providers in our communities. It makes it harder for our state to address disease outbreaks. It also makes it harder for individuals to get mental health care, substance abuse treatment, as well as assistance applying for housing, food, and medical benefits. We saw it again yesterday. The headline said, "Trump cuts affect Washington school food supply." In short, we cannot predict with certainty what is going to happen with our federal funding, but we can be sure there will be chaos and more cuts to come with little or no warning. For example, there is extensive news coverage about potential cuts to Medicaid by the federal government. If, for example, the federal government cuts just 1% from that funding, the impacts could be profound for thousands of Washingtonians. In other words, our budget situation is grim, but it may soon become dire. Those storm clouds are not on the horizon, they are on top of us right now. The good news is there are decisions we can make in the next few weeks that will place us in a stronger position to deal with the inevitable federal cuts that are headed our way. The first and most important thing we can do to prepare for that storm is to maintain our reserves, particularly our rainy day fund. The House budget maintains these reserves. I appreciate and totally support that. Our state treasurer, Mike Pleciotti, has emphasized how important this is. We are already an outlier on reserves, and I want to take a moment to talk about this. We are one of just 4 states in the entire country with reserves at 10% or less of our annual budget. Reserves protect Washington from economic instability, the devastation of natural disasters, and an increasingly hostile federal government. Draining our reserves will weaken Washington's outstanding credit rating and impair our ability to borrow funds at competitive rates for routine or emergency purposes. We currently have a AAA bond rating. It's critical we maintain that. Simply put, the AAA bond rating means more projects and lower costs. When our state is highly rated, it opens up capacity in our transportation and capital budgets to build more schools, fund more environmental cleanup projects, and replace aging infrastructure faster. If we put ourselves at risk of a downgrade, it would make future budgets even tighter and restrict our ability to deliver on needed projects in every corner of our state. Reserves are also critical in responding to natural disasters. Washington is the 4th most disaster-prone state in the nation. The federal government, as you know, is making dramatic cuts to FEMA. It is a sad commentary on what is happening with the federal administration that we can no longer count on them when we have our next natural disaster. We must be prepared to help communities and Washingtonians across the state who find themselves confronting the impacts of, for example, a fire if the federal government does not come through with assistance. It is particularly important to live within our means right now in light of the tariffs that have already been implemented. It's clear, by the way, that more tariffs are on the way, with President Trump announcing his Liberation Day tomorrow. Washington is one of the most trade-dependent states in the nation. In 2024, Washington ranked 9th in exported goods, shipping $58 billion worth of goods to the world. Nearly $120 billion exports and imports flowed through Washington state ports last year. Approximately 40% of our jobs are tied to trade. Washington's agricultural exports totaled $7.5 billion in 2023. Canada is our #1 export market for agricultural goods, and Mexico is #4. A trade war will hit Washington hard, especially our farmers. We have to plan for that. Whatever might happen in the future, we are not currently in a recession, which is why many Washingtonians I speak to wonder why we have a $16 billion budget shortfall. We must balance in a more sustainable way, and based on what our economic experts say, the revenue forecast is. The law does allow us to assume 4.5% growth, even if that's not realistic. That does not mean, however, we must spend to that amount. In the past, we budgeted assuming 4.5% growth, even though the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council projected a lower amount of growth. We cannot do that any longer. Any budget I sign must spend only based on what our economic experts forecast our growth will be. Washington families must budget to the actual salaries of their family members. The state of Washington, as long as I'm governor, will do exactly that. Our budget must also be based on revenue sources that we can successfully defend in court. I said before I took office that I'm deeply skeptical of proposals for a wealth tax. My position has not changed. Despite that, both chambers adopted budgets that rely on untested wealth tax. $12 billion in the Senate, $7 billion in the House. I will not sign that. The legal arguments for a wealth tax are untested. The courts could go either way on that issue. It would be irresponsible to rely on an untested new tax to balance our budget, particularly given the situation we face with the federal government. This is my question to those who seek to balance our budget with a multi-billion-dollar wealth tax. What's the plan if the wealth tax is declared unconstitutional after the session ends? I have not heard a satisfactory answer to that question. I do agree with proponents of the wealth tax on something very important. Washington's tax structure is too regressive. Indeed, we have the second most regressive tax structure in the country. And I'm not opposed to revenue that makes our system more fair. That's why I supported our capital gains tax and successfully defended it as Attorney General. At that time, I was not a legislator. I did not have to take a position on the capital gains tax. I did anyway because I believed that was a revenue source that made sense, and I was very confident we could defend it in court, which we did. That's why I supported a tax on big out-of-state banks, and we successfully defended that in court as well. But we need to be smart about how we address this issue, and that includes adopting revenue sources that we are very confident we can successfully defend in court. There are also important questions about implementation and how successful it will be in the long term. The Department of Revenue, as you know, noted that many countries have ultimately repealed wealth taxes due to high administrative costs, tax evasion, and low revenues. In short, we need to make a sustainable plan now that Washingtonians can rely on. We need to use the time we have, just a few more weeks, to make a plan using revenue sources we are confident will hold up in court. And we can do that by working together. I understand that my approach is making some of my friends and supporters unhappy. That is okay. Sometimes we need to tell our friends hard truths. Our values are being challenged by the Trump administration right now as we speak in real time. We protect our values by making sure we are not beholden to a federal government that has shown its willingness to use funding to punish organizations and states it disagrees with. I have some experience dealing with Donald Trump. When I was Attorney General, we won nearly 60 cases against the Trump administration because we built an excellent legal team. We prepared very, very carefully. We anticipated what he would do next, and we acted decisively. We rarely lost. Hope is not a strategy with Donald Trump. Take my word on that. I am not going to allow the state that I love to be at the financial mercy of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. That is not going to happen. We are in a challenging financial situation. We must not make it weaker. We must make smart choices now so that in the coming months and years, we can protect Washingtonians on Medicaid, support our education system, preserve public health, support Washingtonians facing national disasters, and maintain core services. The time to prepare is right now. Inheriting a $16 billion budget shortfall with a hostile federal government was not how I wanted to start my first term as governor of the state of Washington. There is no point in complaining about it, but I do plan on addressing it head on. Here's what that means. No budget gimmicks, no unrealistic revenue assumptions, preserve our reserves and our rainy day fund, prepare for more cuts from the federal government, preserve our AAA bond rating, protect core services, and balance the budget. If we take those steps now, and we can, our budget will be based on a strong foundation and will withstand the storm that is upon us. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to any questions that you have.
I didn't hear you say anything about the payroll tax. As you know, Brad Smith, president
Yep.
of Microsoft, has suggested it will cost Washingtonians jobs.
Yep.
East Side mayors have said the same thing. I didn't hear you say one way or the other how you feel about a payroll tax.
You're right, Chris. You hear me talk about a lot of different taxes. So we have a whole conversation going on with leadership. So that's a conversation we're having, right? And there's going to be a lot of negotiations going on with legislative leaders. So we're going to have those conversations play out. We've got a few more weeks. But because the budget specifically relied on, as you know, the wealth tax specifically, and I've been communicating my concerns I'm outlining here with legislative leaders, but I felt it was important to let the public know where I stood on that because it was such a big part of those budgets.
So are you entertaining the idea of a 5% payroll tax?
What I'm going to do is have a conversation with both caucuses about what our options are, but I'm not going to negotiate that right here. Yes.
The Department of Labor and Industries requested nearly $40 million to upgrade the workers' compensation system. OFM dropped that request to $17.9 million, and both the House and Senate have included that in their budget proposals. However, your budget did not include any funding for that IT upgrade. Can you explain the rationale for that? And to my understanding, there are also numerous quality assurance concerns. Did that play into your decision?
Yep. So we will have the next 20, I don't know if you want to take this, I was going to mention the concerns letter, but this is KD, as you know, do you want? Yeah.
So actually, just to clarify,
Yeah.
that was a data error that has been corrected. So we have communicated back last month to House and Senate staff that was an unintentional omission of that project.
So you did include,
yes.
or did intend to include
Yes.
funding for it?
Yes.
Would it be that 17?
At the $17.9 million level, yes.
Gotcha.
Thanks, Katie. And I just will add, some of you may have questions about, hey, specific things in the House budget, Senate budget. We will, as you know, the governor sends a concerns letter to the different chambers. We intend to, I've got a draft I need to go through. We're hoping to get that in the next 48 hours or so. So on some specific questions you may have, obviously we're still going through that, going through the budgets. It's a lot of work going on. But look for that in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Governor,
Sure, yeah.
two questions related to the taxes. First, a follow-up, Chris,
Yeah.
question. Both budgets are dependent on revenue from the payroll tax. You're pretty clear on one, but so why are you not taking a more clear position?
Because I'm starting with the wealth
Whether
tax.
you support it,
Yeah.
maybe not the amount, but do
Yep.
you support the tax and you, is it being used?
Appreciate the follow-up. My answer is still the same, but thanks for the question.
Okay, and then on
Yep.
the wealth tax, I want to understand, will you veto any wealth tax bill in any budget with a wealth tax, or is there a level? Would you like to see it tested in court?
Yeah.
And so maybe they'll put something that the budget's not dependent on
Yeah.
it, but it's there. What
That-
would you like?
That's a fair question. What I'd say on that is What I would say on that, what I've communicated to leaders is what I've said to all of you today, obviously. But I have said, hey, I'm open to a conversation about a proposal of a wealth tax that would be no greater than $100 million a year.
No
If they,
more
$100 million a year,
that it would bring in.
that would bring in, that could be tested in court. So I want to be very clear, I'm not committed to that, but there's been a lot of conversation about wealth taxes, you might imagine, from myself and legislative leaders and others as well. And so what I've said in response to that is I'm open to a conversation about that. To your point about, hey, if folks want to see it and get it tested in court, see if it can be upheld, see if it's tested in the court of public opinion, see if it's upheld, see if it can be implemented. I think those are all fair perspectives. So what I've said to them is what I'm saying to you is I'm open to a conversation about that. I've not made any commitments on that, but I'm open to a conversation on that.
So where does your
Yes.
support stand for increasing the cap on property taxes?
I appreciate all the questions on different revenue sources. I'm just not going to engage in those, so I appreciate that. Those are conversations we're going to have. There's a lot of negotiations to go on, but I'm just not going to get into specific proposals right now.
Do you have any concerns about how that would impact the cost of housing in an already expensive state for it?
I have concerns about any revenue source and what that means for businesses, for Washingtonians, you name it. I have concerns, which is why a few weeks ago I talked about, hey, let's look at our budget first. Let's find the efficiencies first. The reason for that was because I have concerns about new revenues, especially given, where our economy may be heading right now with the tariffs and what's coming from the federal government. But that said, we have multiple weeks ahead of us. There's going to be a lot of negotiations on that. I think there needs to be a balanced approach. I'm persuaded by that. But I'm not going to negotiate the details of that right here, and I'm sure you all understand that. Yes.
You previously spoke about implementing furlough days, 1 day a month for 2 years. The state
Right.
budget would allow for up to 13 days furlough, I believe, and the House wouldn't. Have you shifted your stance at all on potential furloughs for state workers?
No. We put those ideas out there for the legislature, as you know, and we've got a very challenging budget situation. And I saw with interest what the legislature proposed in that and what they didn't propose in that. So again, this is all, you guys have all been around here a long time, right? You know what happens in the next few weeks. There's a lot of negotiations that are going to go on, a lot of conversations are going to go on, and but I do appreciate, and I do want to underscore this, that most of what we propose, thanks mostly to the hard work of Katie and the team on reductions and savings, most of that was adopted. And I think that is a big step in the right direction. I think Washingtonians expect us, before we go talking about new revenues and what those look like, that we've tried to go through our budget as carefully as we possibly can. So I appreciate the fact that they accepted most of those, and that I think I mentioned in my remarks, if not I want to emphasize this, they also have their own ideas that we're going through. I'm sure we're going to be accepting and working with them on many of those as well. So, and we're still building that number, which sort of also gets to the revenue question, right? What is the number we've got to get to? Part of it is, hey, how much can we get on the savings, right? There's proposals from one of the chambers on eliminating some tax breaks for entities. I think there's a lot of merit to that, right? Are there the votes for those? These are all the conversations that have to go on as you come in for a landing on a budget, obviously. So, so we're looking at those, and we're glad they leaned into that as well. That's extremely helpful for us as we try to close this out.
Are there any room for further consideration from your office on the budget proposal that came from Senate Republicans with no new taxes and still funding, public safety, schools, all that stuff?
I think I have a meeting in 35 minutes with Senator Braun and Representative Stokesbury, so I'm sure I'll be hearing their perspective. I've been meeting with two of them regularly as well. So again, I won't get into the details of those conversations for obvious reasons, right? We're at a critical time. But I appreciate the perspective, and we've had multiple meetings, just like I've had with the Democratic leadership, and those conversations will go on.
Governor, in
Yes.
your inaugural address,
Mhm.
you vowed to veto a budget that didn't include $100 million
Yeah.
for police grants. Do you stand by that?
I do. Yes.
I had the same question.
Yep. Look, I'll just elaborate on that. It's anyone who's ever worked with me in my time as AG knows I'm very thoughtful about having bottom lines. As you can imagine, as AG, any lawsuit we bring, at some point you're trying to settle a case so it doesn't go to trial, and at some point I just would believe in saying to the other side, this is our bottom line. And anyone who ever worked with me, any entities we had a lawsuit against knows I did not deviate from those bottom lines. If I can just finish, right? I did not deviate from those bottom lines. So I don't make them lightly. I want to be really clear about that. I put a lot of care into and a lot of thought before I put a bottom line out there, because they're bottom lines, right? But that is important. And look, and I appreciate that on both the House and Senate. There are a lot of different proposals out there, so I appreciate that. That folks are looking at that. I appreciate Senator Holy, has been a great ally on this. I really appreciate that, and his flexibility is greatly appreciated. I want to emphasize that. I think he's made it very clear. He's not tied to simply sort of one way to get there, but no, I'm confident it'll be there in the end.
But
Yes.
Governor,
Yeah, if we can get someone who hasn't had a question yet, yeah.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned the state's regressive tax code,
Yep.
where lower income folks pay more proportionally than wealthier folks.
Mhm.
The wealth tax, legislative Democrats have said that's part of addressing that.
Mhm.
There's also a sales tax cut included in the
Mhm.
Senate Democrats' budget, and
Yeah.
included the wealth tax to help make that happen.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to ask a bigger picture
Mhm.
question of like, when is the time to make substantial changes to the way the tax code works in that way?
Mhm.
And I guess, what does the path look like to accomplishing that, just knowing the constraints that there are around tax policies?
Yeah, I think I spoke with that at some length, right? In other words, I share that concern. I talked about a lot when I was running for governor, how aggressive our tax system is. But I think in solving any problem is doing that in a way that is smart and that makes sense and is achievable, right? And so, I don't want to get into the details on the legal side of it for all sorts of obvious reasons, but, I think it is fair to say that the courts go either way on that issue. So it is simply not an option for me, okay, to balance a budget on a revenue source where that is the case. And so to Jerry's earlier question, that's why I've said I'm open to a conversation on something that is very, very small that can then be tested in court. Hey, that's a conversation I'm willing to have because it goes to the heart of your question, right? We do have a system that is not fair, that is too aggressive. That's a fact. So I'm open to trying to solve that, but we've got to be doing that in a way that is that's thoughtful. Jerry, do you have a
follow
follow-up?
up on the question about the $100 million. We
Yeah.
spoke a couple weeks ago. You said whatever Senator Holy was good with, I'm good with. He was good with less than $100 million at that time. In fact, he's good with the bill that passed out of the Senate today. I think had along the lines of $12.5 million a year. So are you still in that position that if Senator Holy's good with it, you're good with it?
Well, I'll follow up with Senator Hope. We'll have more conversation. So, but I'm committed to the $100 million. But thanks for the follow-up on that.
Governor Ferguson.
Yes.
As you know, homelessness in America is at an all-time high. Washington is ranked number 3.
Yeah.
Clearly, the current plan is not working yet. The Trump administration has indicated that they're going to cut some more funding at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that could impact homelessness
Mhm.
even further here. Some of the largest housing providers, DESE, coming out expressing concern. First of all, what's wrong with cutting wasteful spending into programs that are clearly not working and maybe even enabling homelessness on the streets? And also, what is your backup plan in the event the Trump administration does indeed cut even more at HUD?
Well, a couple thoughts on that. So, I think on the point about, hey, what's the plan if there are more cuts? I tried to outline that approach in my remarks, right? Whether it's for homelessness or whether it's for public health or whether it's for education, cuts like that, I believe are coming. I believe that. And that we certainly have to prepare for it. The way to prepare for that is maintaining those rainy day reserves, for example, right? Is to budget in a way that's sustainable, to put ourselves in as strong a fiscal position as possible for whatever those cuts are, and to minimize big investments now, because who knows what choice we're going to face in the future, right? We need to have the ability to help out Washingtonians if they're the victims of a natural disaster, right? That needs to be something we're able to do. So that is why I'm outlining a budget in the way that I am, is so we're prepared for whatever those cuts might be. And hey, whether it's, to be clear, I think you referred to sort of wasteful spending, whatever term one wants to use, but hey, part of our $4 billion in reductions included things I think most Washingtonians would say, yeah, we should cut whether we've got a budget challenge or not. I think there's over $4 million for a warehouse that we were still renting based on COVID times for storage, right? The team identified that. We don't need that anymore. That makes sense no matter what. So I think in whatever area of the budget it is, we will need to make sure that every dollar we're spending is working, right? That it's achieving a goal. And when this budget process is over, which is a little hard to think about right now, but it will be over at some point, and after we give KD and her team a good long break, which they deserve, I'll be preparing a supplemental budget and having a chance to go through in more detail than honestly I've had this time. right?
Is it time to step away from housing first, which is the primary policy?
Oh, this is not the time for a lengthy policy discussion on that. There's a lot of stakeholders and folks who have a lot of opinions on that. But as a state, we need to make sure we're continuing our investments to make sure we're helping out folks who are unhoused. A couple more questions, yeah.
Do you think that an $80 million cut to wildfire funding to preserve the rainy day fund is the best way to handle natural disasters?
Well, I've had multiple conversations with Dave Updegrove, and in terms of what we propose, just to be clear on what we propose in terms of our reductions, we had clear conversations with Dave, and he was very comfortable with what we were doing, and he was clear with me, and I think publicly as well, that what we propose would not impair the work that our team does in Washington State, the really important work when it comes to addressing fires. So I don't know about sort of the latest, again, we're still trying to get up to speed on the House and the Senate have just adopted, but certainly what we propose, I had multiple communications with Dave to make sure what we proposed would not adversely impact our work on that.
Governor,
Yeah.
you stood here a few weeks ago and said, we're not going to tax our way out of this thing. But it sounds like what you're saying today is you're going to have to, in some respect, tax your way out of this thing.
Disagree. I mean, we're not going to, by the tax our way, what I mean is, hey, a bulk of what we're doing is on taxes. That's the two proposals we have. That's my definition of taxing your way out of it, is what those two proposals are. It's not what we're going to do. Do I think a balanced approach is going to be required? I do. But it's not just tax our way out of this thing. That is not going to happen. And I'm confident we'll get there. There's a lot of work to do in the next few weeks, but I'm confident we'll get there. Apologies, I didn't see you earlier. Sorry.
No,
Yep.
no problem. So you said the revenue proposals in both budgets were, in your opinion, too high.
Yeah.
Do you have a top line number in your head?
Yeah.
The Senate's got 17 billion, the House has got 15 billion. Do you have a number you
I have one in my head, but I'm not ready to share, which I hope you understand. Yeah, so we're having a lot of conversation. I just want to really emphasize that. Look, it's, and you all know this, there's a lot of conversations going on. There's a lot of negotiations. There's a lot of critical issues. And bring all that in for a landing in a few weeks is not going to be easy. But do I think it's achievable? Yes, I do. The conversations that I've been having in recent weeks with leadership on both sides, I feel have been very productive. I really do. And continue to be productive. Now look, that doesn't mean there's not going to be strong disagreements on, hey, how much should be the savings side, how much should be the revenue side? Of course. But what I thought was most important for today was to communicate very clearly to the people of the state, where I stand on what I would consider to be fundamentals of what this budget's going to look like, and particularly around how those two budgets are structured now in terms of volume of taxes and the wealth tax taking such a significant part of it. Let's do one last one. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we talk about the federal funding challenges
Yeah.
that we had, and also where the state's reserve funding sits?
Yeah.
Is your office, the House or the Senate, are any of you proposing enough reserves for the challenges that might come next?
It's a good question. What I would say, I've thought a lot about this. So it's a little hard to answer, a fair question, right? It's a little hard to answer because it's so uncertain, right, what's happening at the federal level, right? It's, if, for example, the federal government, stop funding Medicaid funding at all, well, no, of course not, right? We don't have that volume of billions and billions of dollars. That said, as we've gone through this process, and especially in recent weeks with the news coming from the Trump administration, I think it's fair to say that, I've gone from concerned to alarmed by what's coming from the federal government. And that has only reinforced my already strong convictions that we need to budget very, very thoughtfully here to prepare us as best we can for what's coming. Look, there are examples of, right now, I was so glad to see the AG's office, right, joined on the lawsuit on the public health funding, right, which they do amazing work. That quickly, the lawsuit's already there, right? But look, it takes time, for example, to get an injunction. Even if you're right on the law, even if you're ultimately successful, cuts can happen and you're experiencing shortfall on dollars in the time it takes to get that injunction, to stop it, if you're successful. Having reserves can help us navigate that. If something truly draconian happens to allow the AG's office to do their excellent work, to challenge, hopefully successfully, if the federal government exceeds their authority. So, look, is there necessarily a dollar amount that I can guarantee preserves all of our core services for Washingtonians in the face of potential federal cuts? I can't say yes, only because I don't know what's coming. What I do know is, I guess what I'd say is I've had some conversations with members when I bring this up. They say, well, Bob, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. that happens. Look, that is not my perspective, okay? I want to be very clear. That is not my perspective. It's quite the opposite. We may not be able to prepare perfectly for what's coming, but we can do a lot, and there are big decisions coming in the next few weeks that will determine whether we're at the mercy of Donald Trump, okay, from a fiscal standpoint, or we have flexibility. And that is critical right now. Sorry for the long answer to your question, but it's an important one, and it's just difficult to answer just because it's so unknown. And I think I have to say, just as a final thought, is I think I reached a point in my life where I didn't think anything Donald Trump would do would surprise me. I really felt I just felt like I would never be surprised. I have to say that just the last week, just the amount of the federal cuts that seem to be coming, the potential for those Medicaid cuts, that's that's next level concerning. And so I think we just all need to remind ourselves of what's at stake. And as a state, I just feel it's my responsibility as a governor to make sure, while we have time to make decisions, that we prepare ourselves for a time when we are in non-session, right? There are going to be many months where we are in non-session, and things are going to be happening at the federal level. Take that to the bank, literally and figuratively. That's going to be happening. So it is imperative that we make some difficult decisions now to put ourselves in as strong a position as possible. Thanks so much, everybody, for your time and your questions. Really appreciate it, and hope you have a great day.